do believe that it is a skill that you get better at, that you learn, that you become more proficient at over time. And if you're racing short races, let's say the 5K, you're in an advantage. That's because you can race more 5Ks and other short distances because they're not so difficult and hard on the body. You can imagine that a marathon, most marathoners, if you're doing marathons competitively and regularly, you're probably running 2 or 3 a year maximum. But in a 5K, you can run 2 or 3 in just a couple weeks. And that's what I think is so great about short distances. You really can improve and work on your racing skill consistently over time. Whereas if you just jump straight into those long distances, it's going to be much more challenging for you to develop the race experience necessary to become really good at those long distances. So you can become proficient first at the short distances and then apply those skills to the longer distances. Now, the question I got for today was, I have a 16-week training cycle for the 5K. That's my goal race at the end of the training plan. How many times should I race during that 16-week training cycle? This is a great question and really gets to the heart of planning a coherent season. Everything from the length of the season to the number of tune-up races that you're going to run, the distance of those tune-up races, and when during the season those tune-up races are going to happen. So let's go through each one and we'll come up with a plan. So if you're getting ready for a 5K, you have a roughly 16-week training cycle, you'll know exactly how many and when to put those races. So first, if you're racing a 16-week training cycle, then you probably want to put most of the races in either the last half or final third of that training cycle. So you basically want to run races in the final 5 to 8 weeks or so of that 16-week training cycle. Now, I'm kind of talking about a typical standard 16-week training cycle. There's all kinds of scenarios where you might have a shorter training cycle or a longer training cycle that is kind of broken up into 2 mini cycles. The beautiful thing about running is that we can create so many different types of seasons and race experiences. But for the purposes of this video, let's just assume you have a 16-week build to a final 5K goal race. And your tune-up races should come roughly in the final 5 to 8 weeks of that training cycle. So now that we know when to put them in the training cycle, the next question is, okay, what distance of race should we plan for our tune-up races? Now, a lot of people think that you should just be running your goal race distance for your tune-up races throughout the season. And I think that's a little bit misguided because racing is a skill and we can get a lot of other physiological benefits from other distances, both longer and shorter than the goal that we're training for. And also because, like I mentioned, racing is a skill. We can practice racing, even if it's a shorter distance, even if it's a longer distance. Racing is racing, and that skill is highly transferable no matter what the distance is. So if you're planning 5 to 8 weeks worth of races leading up to that 5K goal race, I would probably recommend that you do at least one 5K so that you get a good benchmark. But then it'd also be a good idea to run a longer race and a shorter race. And the longer race can be a 10K. I think that's a perfect long race tune-up for the 5K distance. And then for the shorter distance, these are a little bit harder to find because the 5K is pretty much the shortest road race distance that's out there, that's really common. But if you can find either a road or track race that's in the distance of about a mile or 2 miles, I think that's a really good tune-up race for the 5K. And so what I might do is structure the season so that about every other week you're running a race over the last half of that training season. So it might look something like you get your 5K tune-up race first. That sets your baseline. You're like, okay, that's my benchmark. That's setting the tone for the rest of my races. Then you might want to run a longer distance race about 2 weeks later. Then finally, you can run a shorter distance race, and that will really help to build some speed into your programming and really help you work on your kick and getting outside of your comfort zone in terms of pace. That's really going to come in handy when you start to race the 5K. Then, after that short distance, then you can maybe choose your final goal 5K. So that's 4 races over the course of your training season. Maybe that's over the final 8 weeks, every other week of the season. Now, you can also cluster them slightly closer together. So maybe the final 3 weeks of your training season, you have a race every weekend. And maybe that goes, 5K, 2 mile, then your 5K goal race. And maybe you do a longer tune-up race a little bit earlier in the season, and that's more of your benchmark. So there's a lot of different options for you, but one of the things that I will mention, one of the principles that you should try to adhere to when you're planning out your season is that the races should roughly come in the final half of the season, like I mentioned before. We don't want to race, week 1 of a 16-week season. That's introducing a lot of intensity very early on in the cycle when, according to periodization, we should probably have things be a little bit easier at that point. It was really interesting talking to Kate Grace in one of our last podcast episodes. And she talked about periodization and how she thinks about things. And she had a really simple but effective way of talking about how she plans a season, and that is to negative split the season. So in terms of intensity, she's going to get gradually more intense over the course of that season. And part of doing that is scheduling the races in the second half. So I think it's a really beneficial thing to do. And if you do that, if you plan 3, maybe 4, maybe 5 races in your 16-week 5K training cycle, that would be an excellent 5K season for you. Now, a lot of runners also want to know why plan all these races if I'm training for a 5K. Why run a short race? Why run a 10K? Why even run a bunch of 5Ks beforehand? A lot of runners don't like to race too much. First, one of the reasons is because we are just practicing running races. It's really hard to push your body to the max because we don't do it often in training. Really, it's the race scenario where we find ourselves doing that. And I think it's important to do it regularly and to do it consistently so that we can practice that skill. Now, the other reason why we're going to want to run more frequent races is because it really helps you determine what you're capable of, what you're actually capable of doing in a race situation. Because a lot of the times, and this is true more for marathoners, if you only run 2 races a year, then you're not testing yourself very frequently. But the thing with these short races is that you can do it regularly. So if you're on a tear and you're improving a lot and you're seeing a lot of progress, then that should be very encouraging to you. It's going to build a lot of confidence and it's going to help you inform your pacing and your strategy for your final goal race. So for example, if all these tune-up races are going really well, you're blowing them out of the water, you're just racing incredibly well and you're setting PRs in other distances, then you might want to adjust your goals and set a more aggressive goal time. So there's a lot of very, very good reasons for running tune-up races. Let's just make sure they're scheduled appropriately. Let's make sure that they're appropriate distances. So in other words, you're not running a tune-up marathon before your 5K, and you're not running a tune-up mile before your marathon. And I think you're going to have a lot of success in your next 5K training cycle.